The fact that you're listening to Revolution Health Radio tells me that you care about health as a topic, but also as an issue. The current medical model is no match for the challenges it faces today, let alone tomorrow. We'll always need doctors, but what we need now is an army of healthcare professionals skilled in helping people make diet and lifestyle changes that could literally save their lives. What if you could earn a living making an impact like that? You can. It's the job of a health coach, and they play a critical role in the future of medicine. Now, not everyone who's fascinated by functional medicine wants to do it for a living, but the people who end up pursuing a coaching career start where you are, curious, passionate, and driven to make a difference in people's lives and on the future of healthcare. I consider it my mission to give health coaches the skills they need to make a difference. That's why I created the Adapt Health Coach Training Program, an online 12-month certification that will prepare you for a successful career as a health coach. Unconventional solutions require unconventional people, and if you're one of them and get excited about the idea of building a career and a business by helping other people make real and lasting changes, we need you desperately. Becoming a health coach could change your life. It could also change the world. Go to kresser.co/success to learn more. That's KRESSER.co/success.
Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week, I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Ken Brown as my guest. Dr. Brown received his medical degree from the University of Nebraska Medical School and completed his fellowship in gastroenterology in San Antonio, Texas. He's a board-certified gastroenterologist and has been in practice for over 15 years with a clinical focus on inflammatory bowel disease and irritable bowel syndrome. So I'm really excited to talk to Dr. Brown about his experience treating GI conditions from a functional perspective. He's one of the few functionally oriented gastroenterologists that I've met and have interacted with over the years. And he's developed a specific treatment for IBS, bloating, and SIBO that we're going to be talking about in particular because I found it to be very helpful in my practice. And I will also often recommend it to people who aren't able to access a functional medicine practitioner because it's safe and it works so well. So we're going to dive into that in a little more detail and just talk about some of the research that he's done and he is doing and how he looks at these kinds of conditions from a functional perspective. So without further delay, I bring you Dr. Ken Brown. Dr. Ken Brown, I've really been looking forward to this. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris. Love coming back on the show, and congratulations to all the success that Revolution Health Radio has achieved since the last time I was on. Actually, you were pretty big then also, so thank you for having me back.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. And for the people who missed that first episode, maybe we could just start with a little bit on your background. You're conventionally trained as a gastroenterologist, but then at some point you made the switch over to a more functional medicine perspective. So tell us a little bit about how that happened, what prompted that and, what led you down that path.
So I consider myself a functional gastroenterologist right now. And I know that a lot of functional medicine people that I have met, they have a really cool story about how they were overcoming a disease and then they learned through a different path. Mine's a little bit different. I was actually doing pharmaceutical research and multiple studies. And that's when I realized that, wait a minute, they're really ignoring huge gaps in healthcare. And that's where I started going down this whole path of how can we do things different than how this large pharmaceutical conglomerate is out there developing these drugs, but not really looking at the other processes. So I came about it because I was actually doing clinical research on drugs and went, there has to be a better way.
That's cool because it's a totally different story, like you said, than you usually hear. You came at it from the other end of the spectrum, right?
Exactly.
Of being kind of seeing under the hood of that drug research and then realizing, wait a second, these drugs are just really kind of dealing with the symptoms and the ultimate manifestations of these problems. They're not really actually addressing the core problems.
100%. And then looking back in that time, it's really, I don't know whose fault it is. It's the whole industry, but the pharmaceutical companies put so much money into research and development that by the time they go to a trial phase, they've got that thing pretty well dialed in that they're going to get whatever statistical analysis that they kind of want.
Right.
So they're not going to spend $40 million to get to a study and then have a study blow up on them. So
that reminds me of the Upton Sinclair quote, which I often, I'm sure my listeners have heard me say it a million times. It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary is dependent on him not understanding it.
I've actually never heard the quote, but that makes total sense.
It's one of the great truisms in life, right? Upton Sinclair was good at distilling those. So yeah, I mean, one of the things I've always appreciated about your work is your research focus, which of course comes from your background in clinical research. And that goes, of course, right along with the product that you created, Atrantil, that I use a lot in my practice, and we're going to be talking a lot more about later on in the interview. But maybe you could just, we can set the stage by telling folks a little bit more about your research that you've done and what you're working on now, because that's, I think, a really important, piece of what you do and what you bring to the table.
Yeah. So for anybody that doesn't know, I'm a board certified gastroenterologist in internal medicine and gastroenterology. And I took a big interest in my field and my specialty with irritable bowel syndrome and inflammatory bowel disease and autoimmune process. And that's when I started getting into research, pharmaceutical research, and stumbled onto this concept that we ended up developing Atrantil over, was the fact that irritable bowel syndrome could actually have a cause. And, ultimately that became small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and so on. And so that was the beginning of realizing, okay, there could be this whole new world. And we launched Atrantil about 5 years ago and have learned so much since then. And so you asked what kind of new research we're headed. Once we published our studies on Atrantil, I had to, you have to focus on trying to get the word out, trying to get people, more people on this thing. And so throughout this whole process, I'm being contacted by scientists all over the world. I've got PhDs discussing different aspects about how these molecules in Atrantil called polyphenols can actually benefit people. And that's where the science is headed right now. It's like, wow, okay, if I can get back where we can start doing some clinical analysis, because I'm a clinician, so I want to know, how does this work in the real world ultimately? Yeah. And there's some great ideas out there, and we're working on a few new products actually. So it's really cool.
Yeah, this is definitely an exciting time. There's lots, I think we're just scratching the surface of understanding the microbiome and, how things should work in the gut and the different pathological states when things veer off from how they should work. And, for example, you probably heard this. I recently read a paper where Dr. Pimentel and others are now proposing separate category for what we used to call methane predominant SIBO. We've talked about SIBO, on several different episodes, so I think a lot of the listeners will be familiar with it. We'll back up and do a little primer in a moment, but a fully separate condition now called IMO, or intestinal methanogen overgrowth, to distinguish that from SIBO, which usually involves bacteria that produce hydrogen, whereas IMO would be archaea that produce methane, and they actually result in distinct clinical presentations with different signs and symptoms. And so, we're now really looking at these as maybe related but distinct conditions that might require separate treatment. And this could be a good segue for talking a little bit more specifically about what you do in your clinic, because this is your area of expertise and what you focused on, SIBO and now IMO, and IBS-C, which is IBS constipation, IBS-M, which is IBS that has mixed constipation and diarrhea. And this is interesting because, you and I both know, Ken, when you look in the literature, almost a lot more of the studies talk about IBS-D with diarrhea. It's more common. There are more treatments available for it. And you've specifically chosen to focus on IBS-C and M and SIBO. So talk a little bit about that, how you ended up with that focus and then, what you're working with in the clinic there.
Absolutely. So how did I end up working on this focus involves the person you were just talking about, Mark Pimentel.
Mm-hmm.
I was part of the studies for the original Xifaxan studies, and Mark was sharing his animal data way before it even was kind of general to the public because it was so
Right.
fascinating to me. He's the one that said we'll never be able to treat the methane predominant bacterial overgrowth because Archaeobacter are not bacteria. So I think it's funny.
Mm-hmm.
That was like 10 years ago. And then this year he's saying it's IMO. I'm like, you could have said
Yeah.
IMO back then.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, and for people who are not familiar with SIBO who are listening, which I don't think are, at this point are very, very many, maybe you could just give a kind of overview of SIBO and IMO and then IBS-C and IBS mix and how they're different from, IBS-D, which is the more typical presentation.
So irritable bowel syndrome, as a gastroenterologist, and you've had several gastroenterologists on your show, it really is the most common condition that all of us treat. And what's really weird is that the symptoms that the society has agreed upon are really kind of vague and kind of trash can. Do you have abdominal pain? Do you have a change in your bowel habits? Is the pain relieved with using the restroom for at least once a week times 3 months? Very, weird diagnoses. So the
Mm-hmm.
irritable bowel syndrome, we now believe many of them could be a result of bacterial overgrowth. So studies showed that many people that had an intestinal infection would later develop irritable bowel syndrome. And that's when the whole concept that Dr. Pimentel figured out with animals first and then moved it into human, and has definitely been pushing the boundaries every single time. And I love it. When you have some sort of event, you change the motility. And I'm going to say this a couple times, Chris, because I think that is the future of where we're going to have to head with treating a lot of
I
different
agree.
diseases. It
Yep.
comes down to the motility, and it's really exciting because there's the people that have been watching this, the people that are just now learning about SIBO, meaning my colleagues, are going to be a little bit behind. But when we're looking at this, it comes into motility. So when
Mm-hmm.
something affects the motility, your intestines that normally move continually from mouth to anus, they kind of stop for a moment. And if that were to happen, then it is possible that bacteria can grow. If bacteria starts to grow, then whenever you eat, specifically something like a carbohydrate, because bacteria love those, then they can digest it before you can. And this is how I explain it to my patients when it's a very classic SIBO presentation. And then when you mention that, is there increasing, you're talking about irritable bowel with diarrhea,
Mm-hmm.
definitely the studies would suggest that there's more IBS-D. And off on a quick rabbit hole, I'm not really sure that that's true because many times IBS-C presents as functional constipation. That's the diagnostic code, which is
Right.
how they do the research, versus IBS-C with methane production. So that's just there. So what we do believe is that if you happen to have been normal, you had antibiotics, got an infection, and then you have trouble eating, then it is possible that you have this thing called SIBO. And if you have diarrhea after you eat, it is possible that you are producing hydrogen sulfide. And if you're
Mm-hmm.
very constipated, it's possible you're producing methane. And since you're bringing up the recent articles with IMO and all that, as you know, it's kind of finally a moving target for the academic centers.
Yep.
And I say finally because the functional medicine community has been talking about this for quite a while, and now we've got Mayo doing research on it.
Right.
We've got other people.
It's
So
definitely more on the radar in the conventional world, which is good because we get more research and more insight and data on all this stuff. So let's talk a little bit about the conventional approach to these conditions, specifically how it's lacking, because this is, I mean, as you pointed out, these are not rare conditions. These are conditions that affect a shocking number of not only Americans but people worldwide. And I think the prevalence is even understated because a lot of people are not comfortable talking about digestive issues. And I know from doing intakes on patients for well over a decade, oftentimes and this is more common in males than females, but I'll get a male patient who comes to see me for high cholesterol and maybe declining exercise tolerance and performance, or cognitive issues, and GI problems won't even be on their top 5 complaints. It won't even be listed anywhere in where they could actually fill out their complaints. But when you get to the section that asks them about the function of their body systems, they've got nearly constant gas and bloating or diarrhea every day or whatever, and they've just kind of learned to live with those problems and don't really see them as problems. And so those people are not really even reporting those issues to any doctor or any other kind of research authority. So I'm curious what you think, but I think these problems are even more widespread than the statistics let on, and the statistics are already pretty significant.
Every time they look at this, and when you start realizing that bloating is not even a symptom that's included in the IBS criteria, the DSM or the IBS, whatever 4 criteria that it is now, that's one of the problems. We don't really discuss what the true symptoms are. And you're exactly right. When you see somebody, much like I would do, if I see somebody and they're saying, oh, I've got a little bit of a rectal bleeding, so I'm here to schedule my colonoscopy. Okay. Then you look at their med list, you're like, it looks like you have Hashimoto's. Wait a minute, you've got rheumatoid arthritis also? The second I start asking about gut health, they all have issues. And the reality is the state of our digestive health will determine how we feel physically and mentally. I mean, the GI tract plays such a central role in everything, including brain health, immune health, all the really important stuff.
Right.
So
I mean, there's 2 ways to get energy, right? Breathe air and food. So if one of those is not working well, we're going to suffer. So yeah. So getting back to the treatments, like, again, my listeners have heard me go on about this ad nauseum, but and I wrote a book about it, where one of the fundamental issues with conventional medicine is that the approach is primarily based on suppressing symptoms with drugs and not really addressing the root cause. And I think digestive conditions are really the penultimate example of this. If you look at the drugs that are available for these conditions, it would almost be comical if it wasn't so sad, So if someone has diarrhea, you basically got Imodium and other drugs that slow down the motility. If you've got constipation, you have laxatives. If you have acid reflux, you've got proton pump inhibitors that suppress stomach acid production almost to 0, which has lots of risks, both outlined. And then if you've got IBS, you've got antispasmodics or other drugs that can, reduce that symptom. You've got SSRIs that are often prescribed. But in really no case that I can think of is there a drug that's actually addressing the root cause, with the exception of antibiotics for SIBO. But I don't know if we can really treatment of SIBO has definitely gone a little bit more mainstream now, and certainly some conventional gastroenterologists are using that. And of course, Mark Pimentel would consider himself a conventional gastroenterologist, and I don't know that he identifies. We've talked about this on the podcast. He doesn't necessarily identify as a functional medicine guy, but it's still not widespread. I have many patients who've gone into their conventional GI doc looking for SIBO treatment only to be kind of turned away.
Yeah. So your initial question was, well, like what are you seeing in the conventional? And unfortunately, Chris, this is the whole SIBO thing. Really, it's still on a really slow uptake with most conventional gastroenterologists. Therefore, if you see somebody and they have normal labs and a normal colonoscopy and endoscopy, then it's pat you on the head. Good news, you just have IBS. And more often than not, it's the SSRI that actually gets prescribed first, which is scary.
It is scary. Yeah. And this is a situation that's been going on for a long time too. And so it is I'm happy to see that more gastroenterologists are learning about SIBO and testing for it and treating it appropriately. But I think we can both agree we still have a ways to go there. So,
Yeah, and there one other thing is coming to me in like just big clumps where now it's like, oh my gosh, we got to decide something here. We got to figure it out. Chris, I don't know if you've seen this, but I'm seeing so many people that have had symptoms that clearly were some sort of infection that led to some sort of IBS/SIBO.
yeah.
And then the one autoimmune disease, okay, I'll take it. But then we get into this dysautonomia, POTS, POTS, Ehlers-Danlos thing, which is a whole separate thing. But I'm gathering patients and very smart, intelligent engineers, accountants. They're like, look, I was normal. And then 6 years ago, all this stuff started happening. Now I've got weird heart rhythms and things like that. Have you seen any of that in your practice?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've been over the last couple of years talking so much about the gut, the enteric nervous system, and the connection between the nervous system and the immune system and every other system, of course. And I think that's one of the most underappreciated aspects of gut health. And to your point, I think moving forward, understanding the gut as a nervous system organ and motility as one component of that nervous system function of the gut is going to be the next frontier in terms of treating some of these issues, because I now look at SIBO and IMO as symptoms of a deeper underlying problem, which is usually disrupted gut motility. And I think that's where the treatments, even the more recent treatments like rifaximin and neomycin and some of the drugs, have not, they can be effective, but we also need to learn more about why the overgrowth occurs in the first place, and then develop some better approaches to that long term.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why it's really fun to start looking at this natural space, because when I developed Atrantil, we were looking at these 3 polyphenols, which the polyphenols are those molecules that make vegetables and fruits very colorful, the thing that are very prevalent in the Mediterranean diet. So these polyphenols, I love talking to registered dietitians because they just get so into this part of it, because they understand the antioxidant, the anti-aging, the all these other beneficial things. And there's new terms coming out all the time, like how your bacteria will break them down into postbiotics and stuff. But it's so exciting to sit there and look at, okay, this is a frontier that in my world, I've just waited for a drug rep to show up and go, here's a pamphlet. And now I've got scientists calling, going, we should do a study on this, and we should do a study. And I'm like, like most of us, if I just had more time and money, I would love to do it.
Yeah. So you threw out a term there, postbiotics. It might be unfamiliar to folks. They've heard of antibiotics. Certainly, it was the first one. Then probiotics, and then prebiotics. So what are postbiotics for those who aren't familiar with that term?
This is the new frontier in the microbiome space. And I was taught by several different PhDs, and talked to one CEO who's actually the head of this, and she's trying to develop a company to look into developing a supplement that would feed this. Postbiotics, by definition, are anything that your microbiome will break down into different molecular structures, meaning the metabolism of undigested food. That undigested food can be fiber, it can be large molecules like these polyphenols that we're talking about. Anything that makes it to the colon can be digested by bacteria. Here's another example, would be sugar alcohols. When my patients come to me and go, I've had diarrhea ever since I started this protein shake, I'm like, can I see the label? It says, erythritol or whatever. And I'm just like, yep. That essentially is the bacteria breaking it down and turning it into basically a laxative. So
just public service announcement here. Those are often in keto products as well. For all the listeners, if you switch to keto diet and you're having unexplained diarrhea, that could be one potential cause. And I'm not knocking keto. There's, as you know, I'm a big advocate of it in certain situations, but that is one for people with GI issues that can be a problem.
Yeah, it's just one of those interesting things that postbiotics, and the reason why is because there is, in linking the two different fields, my society, the American College of Gastroenterology, came out about 2 months ago with this consensus statement that really we don't see the benefit in probiotics that are there. And the society's recommendation is that probiotics probably are equivalent to placebo. And what I tell my patients is, if it works, great, stay on it. If it doesn't, let's try something different. I just bring that up because what you're going to see is this scientific push towards, well, if it's maybe not the probiotic creating this change, is it possibly your microbiome, which is creating this new beneficial product called postbiotics? So that's why the whole postbiotics thing, I'm being called by, if you get on, you email one PhD, next thing you know, you're getting another. And I'm like, this is sweet, but it's a lot of information.
Yeah. There's so much to learn. And again, it's a exciting time to be in this field, because I think we're making great progress, and we already have far more tools now than we had even just 5 years ago, to help people with these kinds of conditions. And I want to talk a little bit more about Atrantil specifically now, because there's a huge challenge right now, and I think in the functional medicine world, which is there are too few of us as functional medicine practitioners. So even people who want to see a functional medicine practitioner and have the means to see one, there's often long waiting lists, or there are no practitioners available in their area. And then the other issue, of course, is just accessibility and cost. Many people can't afford the private fees that have to be paid to see a functional medicine provider, and there isn't really good insurance coverage in most cases. I think that's probably a little different for you in your world, because you're conventionally trained gastroenterologist, but for the average person who's seeing a just general functional medicine practitioner, the cost can be a huge obstacle. And people have heard now about SIBO, and they want to get tested, they want to get treated, but that's not really necessarily possible with their local doctor, and they can't see a functional medicine specialist. So, and I'm excited about Atrantil because it's a treatment that I feel like I can ethically recommend to people. It's safe. I don't think it's going to cause harm. It's got clinical research behind it, and it works really well for a lot of people. It's affordable, it's accessible. And for those, 95% of people who hear about this stuff but can't access a functional medicine provider, get SIBO breath testing, and then get the appropriate treatment, which still could be Atrantil. We use it in our clinical practice as well. I think this is a really great option for people out there, not just people with SIBO. I want to be clear about that. Like people with gas, bloating, and IBS related symptoms. So yeah, tell us a little bit about how you, even discovered the polyphenols that are in the product, and what kind of problems you were trying to solve for when you created this product.
So I agree with everything that you just said right there. And when we sit there and look at this, when you were saying accessibility to healthcare, one of the things that I'm really excited about is that Atrantil is natural and it is over the counter, but we also realize that it may be a little difficult for some people. And so we're going an extra step. We're actually meeting and we're trying to see if Atrantil could become part of a conventional solution, meaning part of insurance companies and such, because I think that would bridge the gap. That would open up so many doors for more natural treatments in lieu of just immediate whatever traditional medicine is there. So it'd be really exciting to see if we can get Atrantil out to many other people. But the whole process of how it came about is polyphenols. Remember that polyphenols are these potent antioxidants. And so when I started to develop this and we found that a lot of these polyphenols are being used in cattle to decrease the gas production that they were burping up as ruminants. That's when we were able to dig up all this data and go, look, not only is this safe, but we know that these molecules are actually beneficial for your overall health. So when we did the clinical studies on IBS-C, irritable bowel with constipation, the bloated, irritable bowel, constipated person, then we showed that we had really an 88% response on this. And then I did another study where we looked at people that had failed all pharmaceutical options. So in that study, very similar results. We had 4 out of 5 people that definitely got better. That being said, it's the true symptoms that we're looking for. So if you bloat up after you eat, 15 to 20 minutes, that's kind of classic for what we're pretty good at treating, what we're really good at treating. And other aspects of it was kind of the hard part. When we came out and we launched the product, a lot of people were trying it out of desperation for other things like functional constipation, or they wanted it as a weight loss product. All these things are part of something much bigger. It shows that people are searching for a solution, and they're kind of moving away from the traditional doctor thing. So what you're doing, I think, is amazing. And you say that we lack some of these practitioners, and I love that you have a program that allows people to do that so they can be part of the solution. So agree with everything you said.
Yeah, it's simultaneous efforts, right, to train more practitioners, but also come up with interventions that are more accessible and DIY. And I've always taken both approaches. I'm not one of these people that always says, you've got to see your doctor for every answer to every question. I get really frustrated by that because first of all, a lot of doctors don't have the answers, as we both know. And second of all, we want to empower people to be able to take control of their own health. And, having to see a doctor every time you have any kind of problem is not really the way to do that. So so let's get a little more specific about the polyphenols in the product and how they work specifically, because that also speaks to why they're effective for IBS-C and IBS-M, like gas and bloating and constipation, or a combination of constipation and diarrhea, rather than just, being something that's only for people who have diarrhea or loose stools.
So it's funny because when I was trying to figure out how to fix the bloated, constipated person, I had a very, very myopic view of what we were doing. And I just said, I want to fix this bloated, constipated person. And these are my natural ingredients. And I did not realize that what I was playing with were Mother Nature's secret weapon. So I'm trying to fix this one problem. And then after we got done with the study, we did our second study, and we finally had our first run of production. Everybody came back and they wanted more. And I was like, but do you feel better? And they're like, yeah. And so then I realized that, wait a minute, these molecules are something special. And that's when you start looking into it and you go, oh, they are Mother Nature's secret weapon, a stable polyphenol. So first of all, what is a polyphenol? It's the most ubiquitous molecule in the plant kingdom that makes plants very colorful. And they're there to protect the plant from UV rays and viruses and bacteria and insects. As it turns out, it is a molecule that as humans, our microbiome loves, and we can digest certain polyphenols that then do amazing things in our body. And then other polyphenols are bacteria breakdown. And then that's when we talk about those postbiotics. But what they can do is that they augment so many things. And the first question I get from everybody at this time is, hey, what about my immune system? Talk to me about polyphenols in the immune system. I mean, are you getting the same thing in your, I mean, everybody talks about it.
It's a big topic right now for sure.
So that's what I get. And I answer every single time. Remember that 80% of your immune system is actually in your gut. So if you do not have a healthy gut, then you will not have a healthy immune system. No way around it.
Yep. I mean, Alessio Fasano made that clear years ago, right? That's the gut is a trigger for most autoimmune conditions.
Absolutely. And that's all based off of his data on the tight junctions, intestinal
Yeah.
permeability, zonulin. Love that stuff, because now when patients come to me, I can say, hey, this was actually shown. This is discussed in multiple articles. And then when I sit there and talk to one of my partners, perhaps, they're like, well, there's no science on it. I'm like, no, there's actually a ton of science on it. And then they've kind of learned that I've got a huge Mendeley account. Do you use Mendeley for your journals?
Yep.
Yeah. I've got this huge Mendeley account where I'm like, what topic do you want to know? I will flood your inbox with articles. You challenge me with no science.
Yeah. Yeah. So, the interesting thing about it for me when I was learning more about it and doing my own research, which of course I do, I want to come back to the studies you've done on Atrantil, because again, one thing I really appreciate about the way you did this, which is unfortunately unusual in the supplement space, is that you did clinical studies before you even released the product, and have been researching it since then. Usually supplements are just released, claims are made with no scientific backing, or this is my favorite, when they say, here's our research, and I click, and it's like a Word document, like white paper Word document or
Yeah.
something like that. And I'm like, wait a second, this is not research. This doesn't really meet the standards for research. But the product works, as I understand it, by breaking down hydrogen, and then hydrogen is the fuel source for methanogens that produce methane.
Correct.
And when if you understand that mechanism, then it makes sense that it wouldn't only work for methane predominant conditions and constipation and IBS, but it would also work for conditions which have hydrogen overproduction, because two of the compounds of the three are breaking down hydrogen.
Exactly. So that works almost like a hydrogen sink. It like steals the hydrogen, which decreases the bloating, but it also is preventing the methane or the archaeobacter from adding the other hydrogens there. So after we did the clinical studies on that, and that's why I say I'm myopic, because since then it's just really changed. It's grown. It's only become better, and our studies probably don't do it justice. And I need to find some time to be able to publish some more things. In fact, this is kind of cool. I'll just tell you, nobody knows about this yet, but we were learning so much about the gut health and the immune system. And I was talking to my nurses at my hospital, at my endoscopy center, my surgery center, and I just realized how scared everybody was. And I was like, well, this is crazy. I know the science behind this. And so we launched, I got my team to agree that we launched a frontline program where we just gave bottles away and said, thank you for doing this. Here's why. If you cannot have a healthy immune system, and I would feel really remiss if one of the nurses that I worked with came down with something, and because they're working real hard and so on. And that was it. We just gave it away, and it was perfect. It was cool. And then the survey afterwards, the feedback we've gotten is really incredible, that so many people didn't realize how good they felt after they started taking it. It fixed the bloating in many, but a lot of these frontline workers felt just better going to work, knowing that they had a healthy, at least a healthy gut. And that's where everybody should feel. Honestly, I mean,
Yeah.
everybody should feel like they are eating appropriately, they're taking care of their gut, and you've got this. You're not going into any place knowing that if you don't have a healthy gut, you don't have a healthy XYZ.
Yeah, the gut's kind of the canary in the coal mine, isn't it? It's like often where problems start to show up, and I think that awareness is starting to take hold, at least in the group of people that are our audience. It's not quite there in the general public yet, but Parkinson's, for example, there's a condition that is strongly linked to gut health and changes in gut motility, and it's not entirely clear whether that's, there's probably a bidirectional relationship there, where changes to the brain and nervous system, affect the gut. But we also know there's been prospective studies and other studies that show that there's also probably a causal relationship between changes in the gut to eventual changes in the brain and nervous system that are diagnosed as Parkinson's.
So that would honestly be my opus as my
Yeah.
career. If I could figure out a way to protect the brain and make dementia, just gone, that would be
Right.
my opus, because
Yeah,
that brain
absolutely.
gut connection is something that it's so
Well,
fascinating
I
to me.
think that's where we're headed, and it's so interesting that this connection was well known back all the way as early as the 1930s. There were some researchers at Duke that talked about the gut-brain-skin axis. I discovered this when I was doing some writing and research several years ago, and I was blown away. That the gut-brain-skin axis was a thing. It was known in the 1930s, almost
Wow.
100 years ago. These pioneers at Duke, they talked about even using probiotics to treat these conditions. They didn't have that word wasn't prevalent by then, but they talked about they in their study they talked about using cultured milk, yogurt, to treat these conditions. So it's sometimes in science, it's about rediscovering things that were known but lost, in the
You know what I'm
past.
sitting
And
here thinking is, I'm like, I've got no excuse. I've got the internet. These cats were
yeah,
doing it in
they were
30.
doing it in the 1930s. I'll send you some of the papers that
No, it'll
summarize
make
the
me feel
research.
horrible,
It's
like I'm
interesting.
underachieving.
Yeah, no. So, but I mean, it's what's encouraging is that there's so much research now that is, and we of course have better tools now for kind of illuminating the specific mechanisms of these connections. And I really do think that in the next 10 or 20 years, we're going to totally revolutionize the way that we treat these conditions. And a big part of that is, like you're saying, is going to be maintaining good gut health. And that will start, with reducing antibiotic exposure during childhood, and, aiming for vaginal birth when that's possible. And if not, taking steps to seed a healthy microbiome, which, Dr. Blazer and his wife, whose name, unfortunately, I'm not remembering right now, who's, I think, an OBGYN, and she's explored different ways of basically seeding a healthy microbiome in women in C-section births.
Wow,
there,
cool.
there there's so much that we're learning about this. And the reason that Atrantil is cool is that, and I mean, there are many reasons, but the polyphenols, I think, have like pleiotropic effects, right?
That's
it's not
exactly it. Yeah.
just about breaking down hydrogen, but we're finding that there's so many other things that they do, and they probably, even going back to the root cause of SIBO, may have some impact on the gut nervous system that we don't even fully understand yet.
Yeah, totally. So when you start looking at this, it almost seems you're exactly right. A pleiotropic effect is exactly what goes on, because you can't, I'm seeing this over and over again, you can't outsmart Mother Nature. So when you look at how a whole molecule, a whole plant does something, and then somebody wants to patent it, cuts off a portion of the molecule, makes a pill out of it, and then puts it back out, it's never as successful as the whole molecule. And I'm thinking of like CBD, cannabidiol versus Epidiolex, the pharmaceutical agent that does really good in this one thing, but it has side effects and things like that. So the polyphenol, if you have a large, stable polyphenol, and that's why we chose the three that we did. The one that throws everybody off when we first launch is Quebracho Colorado. Quebracho Colorado is one of the largest, most stable polyphenols in both an acidic environment and a basic environment. And what that means is, a lot of times people take supplements, but they're like, wait a minute, have they done the pharmacodynamics on whether this gets absorbed? Does this get destroyed by acid? Does it get destroyed by base when it goes into the small bowel? Can it survive the pancreatic enzymes and so on? So when we were doing this large stable polyphenol called Quebracho actually stays in the small bowel, which is why it does that one effect. The beauty is that since it's so large and stable, it survives until it gets to your colon, where
Mm-hmm.
your own microbiome does some really cool things. And that's where we've got papers to show that a large, stable proanthocyanidin like this kicks off smaller phenols, terms that other people have heard of, like quercetin,
Yeah.
or ECGC, the
Mm-hmm.
green tea extract, and so
Yeah.
on. So they combine to form almost like Lego pieces. I've described it before that, like, think of like a large Lego model of something. I don't know. I for some reason, whenever I say this, the Millennium Falcon comes to mind. And then it's
Yeah.
as it's going through, certain Lego pieces can be digested in the GI tract. So you knock off a couple, and then what's left is a large chunk of it. That then Lego pieces get knocked off. Those get absorbed, and that's the beneficial aspect of these molecules.
So yeah,
It's
they're having
super
a
cool.
postbiotic effect as well.
Exactly. So it was just so cool to think about this one particular problem and then realize, well, wait a minute. That's why I think this frontline program that we did, and we're going to end up publishing the results on this, that people were so overwhelmingly pleased. Probably, I get it. They probably, they got free stuff. So, but they were also pleased because some of them had improved gut health. Others just felt better. And that's where I think it comes down to. It's that all these combined effects ultimately do something.
Right. And, as I mentioned before, like the two ways to get energy, food and oxygen. And if your gut if you've got gas and bloating, then that's basically a sign that you're not breaking down and absorbing and assimilating nutrients the way that you should be, right? It's a pretty like front and center immediate sign of that. You don't really need any other studies to or even tests
right,
to tell you that, right? And I mean, that from a certain perspective, that's the blessing of that is, with other conditions, you do need testing to confirm what's going on. But in this case, if you're bloated and gassy and have, change like diarrhea, constipation, whatever, it's a pretty obvious sign that your digestive system is not working optimally. And if that's the case, it probably means you're not absorbing nutrients. And I'm talking about both macronutrients like fat, carbohydrates, and protein that fuel our body, but also all of the many micronutrients that we know are critical for health now also are, enter through the digestive tract. So, it makes if you really think about that and you understand it, it makes perfect sense that if it's not just about reducing gas and bloating, it's about improving your nutrient status, which then basically improves every aspect of health, because our health is primarily determined by our nutrient status.
Absolutely. And speaking of nutrient status, one of the common mistakes that I get from a lot of my patients is that they are very self-motivated, and many of them are type A, and they're going to fix this problem.
Yeah.
And they will put themselves on, let's say, a very restrictive diet, like FODMAP diet, for a really long time. And I'm like, I admire your tenacity, but you're going to end up with some micronutrient deficiencies if we don't broaden your diet a little bit.
Right. Usually it's, for my patients, are even more hardcore. It's like AIP, low FODMAP, ketogenic, AIP, low salicylate, low histamine, all combined together.
Oh my gosh! I was going to complain. I'm like, you know how hard my job is. I'm going to shut up right now.
Look, I get it, and I was one of those people. It's when you're sick and you're trying to figure out what's going on, and you find something that makes you feel better, at least temporarily, you're going to stick with that. And especially if you don't have the help and guidance that you need to find other solutions. So it's definitely not knocking our patients, but that's a good example of why we need more of these kinds of interventions that can provide relief and help people get back to a broader, more nutrient dense and varied diet. Because I think what you're pointing out there is that there are potential downsides to long-term restrictive diets. I have no problem with the low FODMAP diet temporarily, but if someone's going to be on that, for years, or if they're going to be on AIP, keto, low FODMAP variation for years, I think that's not optimal. It's way better to correct the digestive issues so that people can actually eat more food and enjoy more food too.
Absolutely.
That's important.
I mean, eating, enjoying, socializing, if there's ever, we're in this period of COVID where stress is through the roof. When you're stressed out, you automatically affect a lot of different systems and
Mm-hmm.
neuropeptides, one of them being oxytocin.
Yeah, I just saw
Uh,
that study on oxytocin and stress and digestion.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, we get stressed, you change your intestinal motility, and sometimes you can develop bacterial overgrowth. They were looking at gastroparesis, and then they realized that in these rats that they were looking at, that if there was higher levels of oxytocin, then the motility improved. And I'm sitting here just going, oh my gosh, I was reading
Yeah.
that and just went, we have got a social distancing, the the the
Yeah. It's a
perfect scenario,
yeah,
chronic stress where,
oxytocin depletion and
yes,
stress.
all of
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
NRF2 depletion, and that's a whole
Yeah.
separate thing. And
Yeah.
so I'm like, look, at least have an Atrantil and hug somebody, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Seriously. I mean, someone in your own household, maybe, but it's true. That's exactly what I was referring to before. I've become very interested in the connection between stress and the gut. And actually, it's funny we're talking about this. I literally wrote an email about this morning that will go out tomorrow or sometime this week. That I think that this connection between stress and the understanding the gut as a nervous system organ is one of the elephant in the room
Oh,
when it comes to GI conditions. And
well, I'm going to throw this out, because when I said that I've had a very interesting group of patients that I've collected, they're amazing people there, but they're so smart. And I've
yeah,
got graduate students,
yeah,
and I've got business people, and they're sick, and they're helping each other now. And I'm watching this, so I'm laughing. I'm sitting there thinking, I'm like, okay, at some point we got to rent a plane, go over, everybody gets trained by Chris, and then we come back. But this is going to be the dream team of people that will figure out the motility aspect,
yeah.
because they're thinking outside the box, and they're amazing, and I I've got, it's going to be really cool. It's really cool to watch when people say, we'll figure this out and we'll tell you how to tell other people. I'm like, that's
Yeah.
cool. I'm
Yeah,
kind of
that's
busy.
good.
It's going to be
That's what
really
we
neat.
do. We learn from our patients and the scientists and the researchers who are on the front lines. So I want to talk a little bit about practicalities here. Since I do recommend Atrantil to, just not only my patients, but friends, family members, general audience, I want to talk about some kind of tips and tricks for how to use it, since this is something you've been doing for a long time now. We both have clinical experience with it. Where should people start in terms of dosage? And maybe that answer is different for different people depending on what their complaints are. What's the upper limit that you think is safe in terms of daily dosing? And then, let's talk a little bit about duration of use, and, what a kind of maintenance dose might look like after the initial problem has been addressed.
Okay. So if you're somebody that has these gastrointestinal issues, remember what we were talking about before. If you can even tolerate it, you're like, yeah, it's not a big deal. I'm used to it. Remember that if you don't have intestinal health, you don't really have other health. So keep that in mind. So I think
Yeah.
it's a much bigger audience, like we were talking about.
Yeah.
So if you have intestinal issues, which seems similar to what we were talking about, bloating after eating, in our clinical trials, and since then we've treated hundreds of thousands of people, and we're getting very similar results. The p-values in our trials were actually pretty good, so we know that we can extrapolate that. So if you're having issues, 2 tablets 3 times a day, with or without meals. We have found that some people are sensitive because of the nature of it, that probably with meals to start,
Yeah.
and then see how you tolerate. So I recommend that 2 capsules 3 times a day with meals, and you're going to do that for at least 20 days. And that's because what I have seen is that people will get much better, and then they stop.
Oh, yeah.
7 days in, 8
Yeah.
days in, and then they're like, oh, then start coming back. I'm like, but
Big
if we're
mistake.
dealing with this bacterial overgrowth, let's just eradicate this, because even when you're taking it, remember that you are ingesting these very beneficial, nature's secret weapon, polyphenols, so that you can get these benefits. So that's the bloated person that's had issues for a long time. Now
And
let's talk.
let me just interject too on that. We know from research that methane, archaea and bacteria in the small intestine can be pretty tenacious, and the risk of recurrence is high, especially if you don't treat properly. So I definitely have found that in my practice as well. One of the biggest mistakes people make is stopping too soon, and then it just comes back. So you definitely, I would err on the side of taking it a little bit longer than you think you should for that reason.
Absolutely. And in fact, even though I was part of the studies with Xifaxan, all of my clinical practice is double the time that the FDA approved Xifaxan for.
Mm-hmm.
So I do the same thing with Xifaxan. If I'm using it, I will use it longer.
Yeah, I am sure you've seen those same studies of. There was one out of Korea that showed the duration of Xifaxan needed correlated with the breath test value at 90 minutes. So, which makes sense, right? I mean, if you have severe bacterial overgrowth, it's probably going to take longer, but the FDA guidelines just say 10 days for everybody, or 14, so.
On a super quick thing, just as clinician to clinician, I'm the whole breath test thing, and I know that you've had multiple experts on there. What I like to use it for is almost like a HIDA scan. If it's really positive or really negative, okay, let's sit and talk.
Yeah.
And I'm having some fun with adjusting how my patients take Atrantil based on the timing of the gas. If it's further down, I'm like, let's take three times a day because I want a higher load in that area.
Yeah.
If it's up high, well, that's one of the things we're trying to figure out. How do I get you to open up without getting the tannin astringency to get going? And I've actually really completely reversed 2 people where it was all about the location of where they were having their issue.
Interesting. All right. So returning to, we talked about 2-3 times a day is pretty standard for GI issues. You just mentioned a case where you might use three times a day. That's for someone who had access to a SIBO breath test, and we saw late hydrogen or methane spike. What about for just general, people who don't have access to breath testing? Is there anyone who would benefit from taking more than 2-3 times a day for a short period of time?
Well, what we know is that these molecules do not get absorbed, and so they're going to go to your colon and then do what we talked about before. So if it is a situation where somebody has these issues and they take 2-3 times a day and they end up with a die-off reaction in the beginning, then sometimes we back off and say, let's ease into it, and then you can do that. And I'm sure that you've talked about the whole die-off reaction before. Yeah. And then there's other people that, like we talked about, that probably bloat. And when I listen to them, and they're like, yeah, about an hour after I eat, man, I'm just miserable. If the person says 15 minutes, you kind of have an idea of where it's going on. So there is, to our knowledge, and I've actually taken obscene amounts of this over the years. When we were studying it, I took a whole bottle one time. I don't recommend that for anybody, just to make sure that there were no other side effects associated with it. So as far as taking too much, 2-3 times a day is what we studied. So that's what we would recommend. If you took a little more than that, there's no real reason to believe that there'd be any type of toxicity or any type of side effects from it. So it's extremely safe because these are molecules in Mother Nature. And then
I can speak to that because I didn't perform the study. So I have a little more freedom than you do.
Well, it's funny because we're meeting with these scientists and you realize the crazy amounts that they're giving, in other studies. There's actually, the beauty is you're going to hear a lot about this because there's currently studies going on in South America, and there's studies in China, and there's studies in Italy right now where they're looking at this exact molecule that's in Atrantil for other things. And, a year from now, we're going to hear a lot about this.
Yeah. I mean, we basically tell our patients to start with that same dose, but there have been several patients who felt like they got a significant benefit at the dose, and then just on their own, even without consulting with us, they decided to increase it, to maybe up to 3 times a day, and they got a better effect. And so,
well, even then, so I was with Mark Pimentel at a dinner and we were talking. He goes, you know, what's crazy is we submitted for this, you know, our phase 2 trial. He's like, but I think a much higher dose of 900 milligrams, like 3 times a day on mice works even better. But in that world, you put your stake in the ground and you go, we're all in on this.
Right.
And so even then, I wonder if even higher doses of like Xifaxan would be more effective. And
Yeah,
so.
it's possible. So, okay. So then what about, you know, you mentioned 20 days, that's like the therapeutic window. Let's consider 2 different scenarios. One scenario is after 20 days, they're like 80-90% better and they feel like, okay, I've achieved that goal. What should that person do? And then the other scenario is after 20 days, maybe they've had some improvement, but you know, it's like 40-50%. They still feel like they have a ways to go. What should that person do?
Those are 2 great scenarios. So you have somebody that's 80% better, and from a holistic perspective, I'm really happy that they're better. Can we take them to 100% on the usual stuff? Modify the diet a little bit, you know, make sure they're sleeping and so on. But we do know that, and this is from my own experience, not published, this is experience from me and all my other colleagues, that if you're 80% better and you continue to do this, one of the reasons why I spoke with a scientist in Italy about this, and they said, but of course, because what you're doing is you're increasing the microbial diversity over time. So when you give your microbiome polyphenols, then these bacteria say, okay, we need to diversify here. If you give your microbiome a Big Mac every day, then the bacteria that love Big Macs say, we're cool, let's just stay right here. So we think that that may be one of the beneficial long-term effects with that. And so 80% stick with
so
it.
yeah,
20,
what does a maintenance dose look like for those people, if that's what you would suggest?
my maintenance dose for the usual antioxidant and anti-aging, anti-inflammatory would just be 2 every day.
Yeah.
So I would say 95% of all my patients take at least 2 every day, and at any given point, they're taking 2-3 times a day, depending on how they feel.
Right, kind of up and down depending on what's going on.
Yeah, and so what's really intriguing to me is that person that shows up, and I'm going to say, I may have misheard you, but did you say they're 20% better?
No, let's say someone who's 40-50% better, and so they didn't achieve the goal that they set out to achieve. Is it safe for them to do another 20-day cycle at that dose, or you know, what would you suggest in that case? Like if they still feel like they're improving, because I guess we could break that down further, where after 20 days you got one person who just doesn't feel like they're improving at all, and they don't feel like they're getting benefit. But I'm talking about a person who's like, they've been gradually improving over that 20 days. It's just been a bit slower than they hoped for, and they're still improving. So they don't want to stop. You know, should they stop at 20 days or should they keep going?
Not at all. In fact, I think this is kind of something that a lot of people have different times and when they actually do this. So one of the hardest things is that I want to tell my patients, I'm like, look, we got 100% money back guarantee. Commit to this thing. Just do it. So don't take 2 capsules. And this happens in medicine also. I'll prescribe a drug and they'll be like, and they being patients, they'll come back and go, well, it didn't help. How many doses? 2. No, this is not how this works. Commit to this.
Right.
This is a feeding your microbiome. This is changing the intestinal lumen so that you have what you need to absorb your nutrients, have a healthy immune system. And what we know is that there's no other pharmaceutical agent that does this, at least right now. I think Dr. Pimentel's about ready to launch his unabsorbed statin product.
SIN 010,
Yeah,
code
exactly.
name. I don't know what the actual name is going to be, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then so 2 capsules every single day is there. Now the final group would be me, which is I'm gluten intolerant. And so I generally am paleo all the time, but occasionally when I do eat some gluten for whatever reason, I get pretty bad distress. So we do know that these molecules, And it's been really looked at with smaller phenolic molecules where these polyphenols bind to gliadin, and then your body doesn't quite absorb it the way it should because it's got this little gel around it. And so gluten intolerance is why I always carried around with me. And then in a little while ago, you mentioned as far as timing, dosing, amount. Basically, everybody I'm within speaking distance to is on this, and they've been on it for years and years. So I've got employees that were with me in the very beginning, and we've all been taking it. I've been taking it. My family's been taking it. So we know that I'm probably like 8 years into the original beta samples of it, taking it. So
Yeah.
I'm probably the the most extreme version of
Right.
trying to figure out if this thing's going to hurt anybody.
Right. And what were the remind me of the time frames in the study? What were the
Oh boy.
period study?
So we launched the product 5.5 years ago, which means
No, I mean how long people took it in the study.
oh, I'm sorry. They
Okay.
actually took it about 14 days. I think it was 14 days,
Yeah.
2 weeks to keep it easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the problem with studies. They're so darn expensive, right? You want to
I
design a study that's a year long of people taking something. It's that's going to be prohibitively expensive in most contexts.
It really is. And when
Yeah.
you start looking at okay, well, what is the benefit? Well, now we're getting something really cool, because I said before that we're meeting with companies about getting on formulary. What if insurance companies start saying, okay, we believe that you have to fail Atrantil before you can get put on X, Y, and Z. Well, that's a really easy way to determine, okay, does the science, does the research match up with the other aspects? Because those insurance companies, they do all the homework, they look at all that. And it would just be so cool to start having accessibility for a lot of different things, like, well, whatever. I mean, all different kinds of products that you use on your patients.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other things that people should be aware of in terms of taking this, like any contraindications or any,
Well,
just things to keep in mind?
I'll just say what I tell all my patients. It's not been studied in children, and it's not been studied in pregnant or lactating women. So
Yeah.
the FDA requires us to say that that cannot be used. I tell anybody who is on an anti-rejection medicine, as if you were, like an organ transplant or something like that, or if you're on a blood thinner, because those have very narrow therapeutic windows. I say I don't want to.
Yeah, let's not risk it.
Let's just not
Yeah.
risk it. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as I said, it's great to have this option for people, because we know just from analytics that of all of the issues, I mean, I've always been a generalist, as you know. I'm not a specialist in one particular condition focus area. But having said that, gut health is the number one interest amongst my podcast listeners and email subscribers and blog visitors, social media followers, etc. And it's really frustrating. It's been frustrating for me in the past to know that there's I'm only able to help directly a teeny percentage of those people. And then even through the training programs, both the practitioner and health coach training programs, fortunately we're able to help more people through those, but it's still just scratching the surface. So having a research backed, clinically validated intervention like this that people can order from the internet and is pretty amazing. And I wish I had a similar tool for some of the other conditions that I treat. So
well, I wish that I had some more resources and more time, and we would collaborate and build a natural research company that would fund itself, and it would be so cool to come around and do that. And
it's on the very long list, right, of things that we want to do.
Which, by the way, you act like you don't. You're like, I wish I could help more people. I think that all of your listeners, you have very loyal listeners. Most of my patients, I would say almost all of them, listen to you. And so, the idea that your tribe can share and recruit more people, can understand this kind of thing, this is where you keep growing. And I love that.
Yeah, it's my mission, and so I'm just grateful for whatever we've been able to do as a community to help folks out there. So along those lines, I want to tell people where they can learn more about Atrantil and buy some if they are interested in trying it out. So the link is kresser.co/Atrantil. So that's ATRANTIL. My confession that I was pronouncing that incorrectly for a good 2 years, I think, before
that's if we had more time, that's a whole separate conversation.
That's my only complaint about you, Ken, is why the heck did you call it Atrantil? Anyways, kresser.co/ATRANTIL. And Ken has been very generous and his team in offering up to 38% off. This is
sitting with the team 38% off, and it's because you make a huge difference, and we just want to get this out there. So this is a very unique opportunity.
I had to abuse Ken to get him to make this offer, so I hope you guys take him up on it, because it's not something that you would typically have access to. So yeah, and let us know how it goes. Send us an email or comment on social media. Send a question in chriskresser.com/podcast question. I'm very curious to hear how it works for you, because it's been so effective in both our clinical practice and just also amongst the general audience of people that have been taking it. So yeah, I look forward to.
And I'll go so far when I see my patients, if they have classic symptoms and they don't respond, that's when I start going, okay, let's sit down and let's start looking for zebras.
Exactly.
So if you don't respond, please go talk to your doctor still.
Yeah, definitely. There might be something else. Ken is also an expert in IBD and inflammatory bowel disease. That's another ball of wax. It doesn't mean you won't benefit from Atrantil, but there's obviously other stuff going on there that may need to be addressed. So kresser.co/Atrantil. And Dr. Brown, pleasure to speak with you again. Thanks for coming on the show. And
thank you so much.
Hopefully we can meet up again in person one of these days when that's a thing again.
Yes, I'm becoming, my oxytocin levels are decreasing. I need some social interaction.
All right. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. Keep sending your questions in to chriskresser.com/podcast question, and we'll talk to you next time. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresserlac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.